Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, Editor-in-Chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. We're continuing our JNS coverage of the war on Israel that was launched by Hamas on October 7th with Uri Kaufman, the author of An Important History of the Yom Kippur War, an event whose 50th anniversary we were already commemorating this month, but has even more relevance because of the parallels with the current war Israel is fighting against Hamas. On October 7th, the world woke up to the realization that much of the conventional wisdom about the Middle East turned out to be utterly false. The horrific terrorist attacks carried out by Hamas didn't just leave more than 1,400 Israelis dead, thousands more wounded, and as many as 150 or 200 kidnapped. It blew up the assumption that Israel could live with an independent Palestinian state in all but name in Gaza, led by the terrorist group. The pain of the loss of life and the depravity of the crimes committed on Israeli soil by the terrorists may never go away. That pain is not just providing the motivation and the determination on the part of Israel's leader to ensure that Hamas is never again able to attack the Jewish state. It will also create a surge of resentment against those Israeli authorities deemed responsible for allowing this disaster to happen. All this creates a set of astonishing parallels with the event that happened almost exactly 50 years earlier, the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which began with a surprise attack by Egypt and Syria. The comparison is easy to make. Both wars began with surprise attacks on Jewish holidays. The initial success of the attackers was due to incorrect assumptions about their intentions on the part of Israeli leaders. Both wars seemed to leave Israel's leaders reeling and looking for answers, and in both cases, Israel found itself being forced to rely upon and listen closely to the advice of its American ally. But the differences are as great as the similarities. The first major difference is that as dangerous as the attacks of two major armies were, which especially in the case of Syria raised the possibility of Israel being overrun, or at least part of it, Israeli civilians were not the target of the assault. In the first days of the 1973 war, many Israelis were killed, but it is not the same thing as the orgy of murder, torture, rape, and kidnapping that Hamas engaged in. In 1973, Egypt and Syria, both then allies of the Soviet Union, were not relying on the sympathy of the international community to save them from the consequences of their decision to go to war once the tide of battle turned against them. Public opinion in the United States and most of the West was clearly with an embattled Israel, and there was little or no pressure from public opinion or pundits to force the Jewish state to stop short of a complete victory as its forces took the fight against the Egyptians and Syrians into their own territory. The pressure on Israel to avoid the total defeat of its opponents came from the U.S. government and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. The Americans had helped Israel enormously with an airlift to resupply the Israel Defense Forces as the war dragged on, but then it wanted to stop them so as to prevent a confrontation with the Soviets and to preserve the possibility of peace negotiations with the other side. That was deeply frustrating for the Israelis, who needed that victory as much for the psychological reasons as military ones. But in the end, it was the right decision since it led to disengagement agreements that actually enhanced Israel's position, and then to the peace treaty with Egypt, as allowing Sadat to save his face gave him the room to eventually go to Jerusalem and pull his country out of the conflict, a move that ended the possibility of conventional war aimed at Israel's extinction that had loomed over Israel for the first 30 years. We don't know what will happen in the coming days, weeks, and months as the current war continues. It may be that the Biden administration will play a useful role in deterring intervention from Iran and Hezbollah while Israel finishes off Hamas. Or it could be that the U.S. will respond to liberal pleas to stop the IDF so as to lessen Palestinian civilian casualties, leaving Hamas bruised and bloodied, but still in place and therefore triumphant. It also remains to be seen whether this conflict will lead to renewed efforts to revive the peace process with the Palestinians, in which the two-state solution will be revived. And that is a sign that as much as knowledge of the past can help us understand the present, it is not a guarantee that this knowledge will be useful or lead to a better outcome. If negotiations and efforts to force Israel to create an independent Palestinian state are what the slaughter of October 7th leads to, it will not lead to peace, let alone an end to terrorism. Gaza is already an independent Palestinian state, and the living proof that in the absence of a sea change in the Palestinian political culture that forces them to give up their war on Israel, and their belief in the illegitimacy of its existence and the efficacy of armed struggle, any such entity will just be used as a base for future attacks. The Israeli security, military, and political establishment have already demonstrated that most of what they thought was true was wrong, and sooner or later its leaders, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, will pay for those mistakes with the loss of their jobs. But if their blunders are now to be compounded by the adoption of the failed American peace policies of the past, then that will do neither Israel, the United States, or the cause of peace any good. Mistaken assumptions about peace negotiations and appeasing forces that are not reconciled to peace can be just as deadly as those that allow surprise attacks to happen. To discuss the parallels between the current war and what happened in 1973, we're fortunate to have with us today the author of an important new history of that conflict, published on its 50th anniversary. Uri Kaufman is a New York real estate developer who spent more than 20 years working on an effort to get to the truth about the Yom Kippur War, visiting battlefields, interviewing veterans, and reviewing archival material. The result was his new book, 18 Days in October, the Yom Kippur War, and How It Created the Modern Middle East. Uri Kaufman, welcome to Top Story.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Uri, thanks so much for joining us today. There is a lot of ground for us to cover, both about 1973 and what's going on now. But I want to start by asking what led you to undertake this project, which has produced a book that has been praised by some of our best contemporary historians like Michael Oren, who blibbed it. Why would you, someone who isn't an academic or professional writer by trade, dedicate your life to writing this book?
I like telling a good story, and this is one for the ages. If I'd have brought this to my agent as a novel, she'd have kicked me down the stairs. She would have said, there is no way this could possibly happen. But it did happen. You have this unbelievable story with all the suspense and intrigue and the swashbuckling General Ariel Sharon and Anwar Sadat's right-hand man selling secrets. And above it all, you have Golda Meir, the first woman in the history of the world to rise to lead a nation by herself. She was not related to any male politician or king. She rose to lead a nation all by herself, had to make a set of unbelievably difficult decisions. She got them all right. Israel won the war. You can't make this stuff up. It's about as good as it gets on a good day.
Okay, well, let's start by discussing some of the obvious similarities between 1973 and 2023 and why they are so striking. Run me through what you see as the greatest similarities.
There are a lot of similarities. Tactically, the biggest similarity is, at least, look, the reports from the region now are still pretty sketchy. But our best guess is that Hamas did in 2023 what Egypt did in 1973, which is to mobilize an army, have it train right along the border, and then have it demobilize. And then do it again, mobilize on the border, then demobilize, and do it again and again and again and again. The Egyptians did it 22 times just between January 1st, 1973 and October 6, 1973. On the 23rd try, the Egyptian commander said, okay, now go on the attack. So when you do it that way, you don't have to tell many people what your intentions are. It's obviously impossible for an intelligence agency to know what those intentions are. If they see an army on the border, no way to know if it's going to attack or if it's just training. Israel captured 8,000 Egyptians in the war. Only one knew about the attack as late as October the 3rd. All the rest, or practically all the rest, found out about it the morning of October the 6th. From the reports out of the region, and again, it's still preliminary, it seems like Hamas did the exact same thing. They would train along the fence and then demobilize and then train and demobilize. And so that story on CNN showing them running around in the village, and the analysts said, wow, they were training. How could the Israelis not see this coming? Well, the answer is simple. They trained along the fence and then demobilized and did it over and over. And a Hamas official named Ali Barakah said on Russian television that really only a handful of people at Hamas's highest level knew that on this occasion, on October the 7th, they were going to order them to go on the attack. So that's one parallel. The bigger parallel, I think, and the more important one, is that in both instances, Israel was done in by core assumptions. So in 1973, that core assumption was known as the conceptia, or the concept. The conceptia said Egypt would not go to war until it got advanced Soviet fighter jets that could contend with the Israeli Air Force. Since those fighter jets were not due to arrive until late 1974, or even later, the Israelis figured they were okay in 1973, and then they found out that Anwar Sadat had concepcias of his own. The same thing happened with respect to Hamas, but in Hamas's case, it really is much more strategic. What happened there was Israel occupied Gaza for a while. We all know that. And when you are an occupier under the Geneva Convention, you are required to assume the responsibility for the local population. And Israel did that and did it admirably. The per capita GDP of Palestinians tripled in the years after the 1967 war, and their lives improved at a whole array of socioeconomic metrics, whether it was literacy or infant mortality, etc. But once Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, under the Geneva Convention, it gave up all those responsibilities. It owed Gaza nothing. Nevertheless, because Israel really is a light on two nations, and partly out of self-interest, they continue to supply Gaza. So they supplied them with food and water and clothing and every sort, and electricity, and then fuel for a power plant in Gaza. And to pay for all this, they gave almost 20,000 Gazan Palestinians licenses to work in Israel. This is utterly unprecedented in the history of the world. It never happened that one nation supplied the other in time of war. It would be as if America allowed 20,000 Germans to work in America during World War II so they could pay for supplies to be sent back to Berlin. In Israel, the conception was Hamas would never cut off that economic lifeline. Their interest would be to keep it going. Yeah, there'll be violence, there'll be occasional rocket fire, but Hamas has no interest to commit economic suicide. Well, once again, the Israelis found out that Hamas had conceptions of its own.
Yeah. Now, at the heart of both debacles are mistaken assumptions on the part of the security, military, and political leadership of Israel about their opponents. Why were those assumptions about Egypt and Syria not trying another war and Hamas not being interested in a wider conflict so deeply embedded in the consciousness of the Israeli establishment?
So that's a great question. And the answer is that practically every disaster happens exactly for this reason. People go out with a set of core assumptions. And once they have those, it's very hard to think out of the box and think that maybe those assumptions are wrong. Let me give a perfect example in a totally unrelated area.
Yeah, it's confirmation bias that can apply to more than just the military, you know.
Oh, absolutely. And that's how the housing crisis happened in 2008. I have a day job. I'm a real estate developer. I remember the 2008 crisis well. Then the conception was the housing market in America had never collapsed in every region of the country at the same time. So if housing went down in California, it would hold firm in, say, Florida or Illinois. So someone had the idea. Her name is Blythe Masters. By the way, total coincidence, her father was the only British pilot who was not a Jew who volunteered for the Israeli Air Force in the 48 war. He was a hero for the Jews. But anyway, she said, let's put together these packages of mortgages from all over America, one from Colorado, one from Illinois, one from Michigan. And then you can't go wrong because it was impossible for the housing market to collapse everywhere at once. And then we all know what happened after that. An Israeli general named Moshe Bogi Ya'alon, who headed up a man, later he became chief of staff, and then he was, defense minister. He said that when he became the head of a man in the 90s, he said, let's do away with all our preconceived ideas. Let's have
that's military intelligence.
Correct. Right? The head of military intelligence, forgive me. That's right. He said, let's try to have no core assumptions. And they found almost immediately that it was impossible. You have to work around certain core assumptions. Everything works this way. And so again, when people, well, in the case of Hamas, act in a way that's completely counter to their own material self-interest, it's very, very hard to detect something like that. What they should have maybe thought of was that Hamas had its own concepcia. And here's what it was, or at least this is as best we can tell right now. Hamas's leader is a mass murdering psychopath named Yahya Sinwar. Sinwar was convicted in an Israeli court in 1989 of murdering 5 people, all of them Palestinians, suspected of being collaborators, 2 of them with his bare hands. And Israeli prosecutors said at the time that he was involved in the murders of over 20 other people, but they figured after they got 5 consecutive life sentences, that was good enough. Now, Sinwar was freed in the Gilad Shalit deal back in 2011. So was another senior Hamas leader named Ali Kafi, who actually just killed in an airstrike. I would venture to say that Sinwar said to himself, wait a minute, the Israelis freed 1,027 terrorists to get 1 soldier back, Gilad Shalit. If we have 199 hostages, as they now claim they do, they'll never fight back. We can demand whatever we want. And the fact that the Biden administration recently gave Iran $6 billion just to free 5 Americans, again, probably strengthened the sense that Westerners are weak. And if you just have a couple of hostages, they'll do whatever you want. So maybe that economic lifeline won't get cut off. Maybe Gaza won't be attacked by Israel because of the hostages. He is about to get a civics lesson in how democracies really work when you go too far.
Well, I guess so. I guess that's, we've talked about the similarities, but the 2 conflicts, there are also some equally obvious differences. How is today's conflict different from that of 1973? And I'll lead with one in that the surprise 50 years ago was not as complete, as Israel had a chance about seeking to forestall the attack in the last 24 hours before the enemy struck. That wasn't the case last week.
That's completely correct. The other difference is the Israeli army was, I think, somewhat better prepared in 73 than it was this time. What happened this time was a complete fiasco. It hasn't been investigated yet. There's going to be a commission of inquiry. They're going to get down into the weeds, and it's all going to be out there. But the early reports are really pretty damning. They were caught completely by surprise. Hamas knew everything they needed to do to instill confusion in the Israelis. There were hours that went by when the Israelis had absolutely no idea of just how bad it was. The one thing I do want to say, though, is the thing they both have in common was the unbelievable heroism of the Israeli soldiers on the ground. The stories of 1973 were absolutely remarkable. Along the canal, the soldiers were third-line troops. It was the Jerusalem Brigade. It was mostly people who immigrated to Israel in middle age, got some very basic training. No one thought there'd be a war. One of the outposts, they were called Ma'ozim, the Ma'ozim were on Golan Heights. One of the Ma'ozim held out for a whole week against thousands of Egyptian soldiers with nothing but a couple of machine guns. We saw the same thing in Israel. And let me just put it in these terms. The estimates are that 4,500 of these mass murdering terrorists crossed into Israel, heavily armed with Kalashnikov rifles, many, many, many bullets, explosives, etc. I don't have to tell you how many people get killed in each mass shooting in America. The kill ratio was less than 1-to-1, which is really incredible. So far, they've counted the bodies, according to reports from the region, of 1,500 terrorists and 1,200 Israelis. Now, obviously, 1,200 Israelis is a hideous, horrible toll.
Yes, right. They're talking about maybe 1,400 now. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, it's gone up since because of the continuing conflict. But on the first day, it was probably about 1,200 Israelis. If you said to me 4,500 raging psychopaths, terrorists with automatic weapons were going to get to run around, I would have estimated that far more innocent people would be murdered. But it's a testament to every Israeli who had a handgun, every Israeli who had any gun, got in their car, drove towards the fighting, not away from it, and engaged these terrorists and kept it to, I guess, as one could think is perhaps the lower number than it would have otherwise been.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, the cliche about the Yom Kippur War was that the ordinary rank and file soldier were the ones who saved the country. It was the generals who were screwing things up. And I think you're right. It's all the people who responded to the attacks last week, as much like the stories of 9/11, people, the firemen charging towards the fire, not away from it, that may have prevented it from being even worse, although it was incredibly bad.
The story that rarely gets told, talking about 9/11, I had a dear friend in law school, wonderful guy named John Perry. One of those guys, he just had to say his name and people would crack a smile. He was an African-American, 6'4". He made money on the side as a model. He was a really good-looking guy. Everybody's favorite guy. He took a job when we went to law school together, NYU. When he got out, instead of going for the big bucks, he took a job in the police department in internal affairs, which has got to be the most miserable job on earth because you've got the low pay of a police officer without the camaraderie. Obviously, the other cops can't stand you because your job is to investigate them. On 9/11, it was his last day as a cop, and he went down to One Police Plaza, which, of course, is right next to what was the World Trade Center, handed in his gun and badge. That's when the plane hit. He demanded his gun and badge back, took them and ran into the building to help people, and that's where he was unfortunately killed. And thus did we lose John Perry, a great American hero. So I don't know why, and that's not related to the Yom Kippur War, but I just felt compelled to tell that story.
Well, heroes are heroes, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Now, one of the fascinating things about the deep dives that are being conducted into the 1973 war, including your book, has been the way that Golda Meir's stock seems to have gone up. Though Americans, or at least those old enough to remember her, still think of her as a symbol of the Jewish people, Israelis of the 1973 generation viewed her very differently, and they thought of her as having failed them and being responsible for the deaths of thousands of soldiers who might have lived had she not held back from striking first. Your book makes a pretty good argument for her, perhaps a much stronger case, I might add, than the new film Golda starring Helen Mirren. Why should Israelis or anybody else who's thought about this rethink their view of Meir's leadership?
So here's where that falls in. What happened to Golda, first of all, with respect to the surprise and the initial failure, the Agranat Commission, which was formed right after the war, it was headed up by Israel's Chief Justice, a man named Shimon Agranat, who, by the way, was an American who made Aliyah. They exonerated her. They said the surprise was not her fault at all. They were, and I think, completely correct in that assessment. No facts have appeared in the ensuing years to question that. With respect to her leadership during the war, it was fabulous. After the initial surprise, I would even describe it as near perfect. She was handed an impossible situation. She had to make a string of absolutely brutal decisions, each more difficult than the other, and she got them all right. She ran the table. And if she had not done so, Israel would have lost the war. The reason she was denigrated in Israel, and it's important to make that distinction. In America, she maintained her reputation as she should have. But in Israel, what happened was the Israeli left wanted the moral of the story to be, well, you have to trade land for peace. If you don't trade land for peace, you end up with the Yom Kippur War. And so they invented this myth that Golda could have signed a peace treaty before the war, but as they like to say, she chose war over withdrawal, so Israel got war and then withdrawal. Okay, that's completely false. There's not even a kernel of truth in it. Sadat was not willing to make peace before the war. Golda did offer to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. She wanted security guarantees. It was called sovereignty for security. But she offered to withdraw it. It's just a complete distortion of history to say otherwise. Maybe now enough time has passed that a reassessment could happen in Israel. One can only hope.
Yeah, I think that's true. Obviously, Meir was operating under, tremendous handicap. She was not somebody who had a military background. She was reliant on her advisors, both, military and, the intelligence. And, they were the ones who failed, clearly. And she was also ill at the time, something that Israelis did not know. She was, undergoing treatment for leukemia, I believe. Lymphoma, excuse me. And as the movie shows, she's smoking like a chimney and under incredible strain, and not young. But it was the person who was also, the commission also vindicated Moshe Dayan, and he does not come out of this very well. Certainly not as well as Meir does in retrospect.
So that's all true. By the way, she was not sick during the war. What happened was she got the job precisely because she was a compromise candidate. In 1969, Levi Eshkol passed away from cancer. And the battle was between Moshe Dayan, who was the hero of the 1967 war, and Yigal Allon, who was the hero of the 1948 war. And the Labor Party deadlocked. So as a compromise candidate, they said, oh, Golda's perfect. She's dying. They found her in a convalescent home in Switzerland. She wasn't thought to be able to live more than another year or two. Elections were planned for late 1969, so they figured she could be a caretaker. And then by the time the elections would come by, the Labor Party would figure out who they wanted, Dayan or Allon. As it turned out, she rallied. She often said that her sickness was she wanted to be prime minister, and once she became prime minister, she was cured. But her cancer went into remission. She was not treated for years. It only returned well after the war, as a matter of fact. Although she did get shingles in January of 1974, probably from the stress. Yes, she was a chain smoker. She was smoking 7 or 8 packs a day during the war. Of course, she started smoking in the 1920s before people really understood how dangerous this stuff was. But during the war, she was actually quite healthy. She did say later she considered suicide. That's how bad Israel's situation was. But the woman was made out of galvanized steel. She stood down Kissinger. She stood down Moscow. She stood down really the whole planet and just said, we're going to win this war, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah, I think the accounts of the arguments and of the cabinet, she was the one who didn't lose her head, not all the tough guys around the table. And one of the most dispiriting things about reading about what was going on behind the scenes with Israel's leaders was the way some of them, notably, as I just said, Minister of Defense Moshe Dayan, seemed to be losing their nerve in the crisis, though certainly Meir did not. That's something we hope is not happening in Jerusalem now. Can you tell us a little bit more about the conflicts in Meir's cabinet as the war unfolded?
Well, there was a lot of infighting, as you have in almost every government. Most of the real hatreds in politics are within the same party. They're not across the aisle. When you're across the aisle, you can argue on ideological grounds. Within a party, you're fighting on biography, and that can get vicious. The Rabin Shimon Peres fight was epic, although that didn't really make itself felt in this conflict.
No, Rabin was safely in Washington, which saved his reputation. He was Israel's ambassador to the United States at the time of the war. Had he been at the front, it might have not gone as well for him. Yeah.
Well, if he'd been at the front, I agree. Actually, by then he had just gotten back from Washington. He was a minor minister in the government.
Right,
but
yeah.
No question. It definitely rescued his reputation. The real hatreds were among the generals. Dayan did not get along with Israel's chief of staff, David Elazar, who is the unsung hero of this war, because when Golda found her nerve, it was always following the advice of Elazar. She always took Elazar's advice, which was to fight and be aggressive, and not Dayan's advice, which was always to try to play it safe. And then, of course, within the army, everybody hated Ariel Sharon because he was an impossible man to command. But he just went out and, with an unauthorized attack, won the war for the Israelis. And like I said, you can't make this stuff up.
Yeah, I mean, there were all kinds of other things. I know, Israel's foreign minister, Abba Eban, hated Golda Meir, and it just, that the stories just go on and on. But of course, another element, which you just, in the 73 conflict that you just alluded to, was the so-called War of Generals, in which feuds rooted in past antagonisms, as well as failures in the war's opening days, led to open conflict inside the IDF. Tell us a little bit more about how that worked with Chaim Bar-Lev, who's unfortunately the Suez Line was named after, and the Southern Command leader Gonen. They all seem to be at each other's throats.
That they did. These men did not like each other, and it even got in the way of strategy at some point. Look, generals are often not going to get along. There's no one could stand Bernard Montgomery. There was a lot of tension with George Patton in World War II. No one could stand Douglas MacArthur. A lot of these people are not very likable. I mean, being
Big
a good
egos.
general, very often does not come with being a fuzzy kind of person. But where it really became problematic was, for example, the Israelis finally laid a bridge. And what you have to appreciate is Ariel Sharon was not just a person who a lot of these guys couldn't stand. And Chaim Bar-Lev had fights with him that went back to the 1950s. Ariel Sharon is sometimes called the George Patton of Israel. In the 50s, he actually slapped a soldier. And the guy who tried him as the judge was Chaim Bar-Lev. Chaim Bar-Lev tried so many times to end his military career. Each time he failed. He wanted to end it in 1969, but then he was told by the Labor Party that if you kick out Sharon, he'll run with Likud, and he'd be an electoral asset, so keep him in the army. So that's how he got the promotion to be the what's called Aluf Pikud HaDarom, which is the commander of the Southern Theater. A lot of these disputes were even rooted in politics. Sharon was a Likud guy. Chaim Bar-Lev was already in the government as a labor guy. They didn't want Sharon to get the credit, which is why to this day, the decisive battle of the Yom Kippur War was fought in a place called the Chinese Farm. And the generals made sure that the people who got the credit for winning it were the paratroopers, even though the paratroopers themselves said they didn't win the battle at all. They walked into an ambush and got slaughtered. The guy who won the battle was Ariel Sharon west of the canal because he ordered an attack against, he violated his orders. It was totally unauthorized. And he sent a group of men further north till they came to a village called Sarafayum. And in there, he ordered them to just open fire and go crazy. And one of the men was named Asa Kadmoni, and he got on the roof of a building. And by himself, he held off about 300 Egyptians for 4 hours. They even overheard Egyptian intelligence radioing back, there's a crazy Jew on the roof and we can't kill him. He's unkillable. That's what won the battle. But the senior brass couldn't let Sharon take the credit. Oh, by fighting on the West Bank, the Egyptians withdrew from the East Bank from the Chinese Farm. That's what won the war. But they couldn't let Sharon take the credit, so they gave the credit to the paratroopers. And as I said before, you can't make this stuff up. It's like a novel.
Yeah. Now, that's the thing. The Yom Kippur War destroyed a lot of Israeli reputations, especially in the military. But it was, in a sense, the making of one man's career, Ariel Sharon, whose decision, I might add, as prime minister to leave Gaza 32 years later can be said to have led directly to the October 7th debacle. His push across the Suez Canal, which you describe in great detail, and you just alluded to it, was essential to the victory. Your book discusses why his colleagues in the IDF and Golda Meir didn't entirely trust him. And that part of that, as you just said, was politics and personality. Tell us a little bit more about, the way Sharon operated. It wasn't just that he had ideas and, we don't like this guy. I mean, this went back to the 1956 war. I mean, these were very personal dislikes and deep distrust. And, they really didn't trust anything he said, and he didn't trust anything they said.
Oh, well, Ben-Gurion said it best. Sharon could be a great general if he could just stop his habit of lying. He was constantly violating his orders, constantly doing what he wanted to do. Great story. In 1967, the paratroopers were on Mount of Olives looking down on the old city. And Rabbi Shlomo Goren was up there losing his mind, saying to the commander of the paratroopers, "What are you doing up here? Go take the Kotel. You have the first chance in over 2,000 years. But Matagur, who was the commander, said, "I need orders." And one of the paratroopers of Yoel Ben Nun said that Rav Shlomo Goren's problem was he was used to Sharon. And if Sharon had been the commander, he would have sent in a scouting party. They would have been fired upon. He then would have sent reinforcements. And before you know it, the whole thing would have rolled up and they would have taken the Kotel. And that's kind of the way Sharon operated. There was always general orders, and he'd start something small. And before you know it, there was this whole invasion, and he would just constantly go off and do what he wanted to do. Sometimes it failed. It failed very, very badly. On two hills called Hamutal and Machshir. I describe it in the book. It happened on October the 9th. The Agranat Commission offered scathing criticism of that battle. Sharon almost lost his job, but when it came to crossing the canal, west of the canal, because he launched that unauthorized invasion, Israel won the war. Most of the men, though, who he commanded loved him. I had the privilege of going to the Chinese Farm back in 2006. And there was a lieutenant colonel there I was interviewing, and he went off about a general that he didn't like. And then on his own, he just stopped in the middle and said, those things just didn't happen in Sharon's unit. And there's another retired general named Amnon Reshev who wrote a terrific memoir. I'm not sure if it was translated into English. And he said they loved Sharon. And if it hadn't been for him, they would have lost the war.
Yeah, he had a tremendous personal charisma. I mean, he was a natural leader. And whereas some of the other generals, Gonen in particular, just seemed to turn everybody else off. Another key element in both conflicts is the role that the U.S. played then and now. While the Israelis were deeply frustrated by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's opposition to Israel, forestalling the attack before it started, and then forcing the IDF to stop short of complete victory against Egypt, I think you can make a strong argument, and I think you do in your book, perhaps, that this led eventually to peace with Egypt and a realignment that basically ended the threat of another conventional war aimed at Israel's destruction. We don't know yet where the Biden administration will ultimately end up with respect to influencing Israeli policy or the future of the current conflict. But what are your thoughts about the role that the U.S. can or will play now and compare it to what happened in 1973?
So Winston Churchill famously said the Americans always do the right thing after they exhausted all the other alternatives. And I think that pretty much sums up Henry Kissinger's leadership during the war. I want to be clear. After the war, he was fabulous. He was able to use his genius and his mastery of detail and mostly his patience with shuttle diplomacy going back and forth and back and forth. And it took months and it was really painfully difficult. And many others would have given up. But he hammered out some very, very difficult agreements. He deserves full credit for that. As for his leadership during the war, that's another story altogether. If Israel had listened to him, they would have lost the war. And if they had lost the war, there would never, ever, ever have been a Camp David peace treaty. Kissinger pressured Golda to give up its stranglehold on the Egyptian Third Army. He did that because he wanted to get the oil embargo lifted. Luckily, Golda said no. And the Egyptians gave in. That's why Israel won the war. That's why they had the separation agreement that basically made it impossible for Egypt to fight future wars because they couldn't launch any more surprise attacks. So Sadat was faced with this stark choice, make peace with losing most of the Sinai Peninsula or make peace with Israel. He wisely made peace with Israel. Syria was faced with a similar choice, and both Assad, Hafez the father, Bashar the son, chose not to make peace, so Syria never got back the Golan Heights. I think it can be said pretty with near certainty now they never will. And I just want to make one more point on Kissinger. He was so anxious to restrain Israel that on October the 22nd, he signed that ceasefire in Moscow. It only took them 4 hours to come to that conclusion. The Arabs imposed the embargo on the 20th, 2 days before. So just common sense, all he had to do from Moscow was pick up the phone, call Faisal, King Faisal in Saudi Arabia, and say, look, you want me to rescue the Egyptian Third Army, which the Israelis are about to surround. Okay, I'm willing. You gotta lift the embargo. I'm not gonna help you. If you don't help me, I'll give you a ceasefire if you give American motorists a ceasefire. He didn't do that. I asked many people why. 2 of his aides told me he just made a really bad mistake. I think that's just common sense, and I don't think he did a very good job defending American interests during that war.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think most accounts of the war, and even accounts of Kissinger's own conduct during the war, leave that out, and I think that's an important point you make in the book. So credit to you for highlighting that. That's a sort of worth, that's one of the highlights of the book for me. Now, the 1973 war was the last one that Israel would fight in which conventional armies were stacked against each other as they had been before that. From then on, it has been stuck in asymmetrical battles against terrorists where its military and technological edges haven't always been decisive. And today, Hamas is not alone, since Iran and its terrorist auxiliaries and Hezbollah are part of the equation. What do you see as the next step? As Israel deals with this in this conflict, how does it cope with this? How do the Americans play into it? What are your thoughts about that?
So this is what I see. Make no mistake about it. Israel is going to wipe out Hamas, even if it means destroying Gaza. And the old order is finished. I do not see a scenario where Israel goes back to supplying Gaza. So Gaza is going to become essentially a ward of the international community. It's going to live on humanitarian assistance, much like the Arabs living in Idlib
I guess I should stop you. And you're assuming that Israel will go in and will take out Hamas. You don't think the United States will stop it. You don't think the international community will. You're sure that the consensus within Israel will be such that it will withstand any international pressure, which we're sure is already building for it to not attack.
That is correct. I do not see a scenario where they stop. I've been watching Israeli media for a long, long time, decades. I have never seen the level of anger that I'm seeing on Israeli TV. I mean, even the Peace Now left-wing people are saying, get in there and wipe them out. I've never seen anything like this before. I am also not convinced that America has the leverage to stop Israel, even if it wanted to, and I don't think it's inclined to do so. Let me point out, big differences between this Israel and the one that Golda Meir led. The Golda Meir Israel only had a little more than 3 million people, a little more than Brooklyn. This Israel has almost 10 million people. The last figure I saw was 9.8 million. Maybe if you got to take out East Jerusalem, so let's say it's 9.5 million people, something like that. More importantly, the Israel of 1973, adjusting for inflation, had an economy, a GDP of about $49 billion. The current Israel has a GDP of $564 billion. This is a very wealthy country. American aid is less than 1% of GDP. They can live without American aid if they have to. I do not see a scenario where the international community imposes sanctions on Israel. That would be insanity. I also don't see a scenario where America cuts off weapons. And if it does, Israel makes most of its own weapons. I don't even think we have the leverage, even if we wanted to use that leverage. So yeah, Hamas is going to get wiped out. The big question is, well, what happens after that? And what I think is going to happen, and what I hope they're working towards, is a scenario in which there is a multinational Arab force spearheaded by Egypt and Saudi Arabia. That multinational Arab force will prop up the Palestinian Authority, which is, of course, Abu Mazen and Ramallah, for them to come back and govern Gaza and keep the peace. So why would Egypt and Saudi Arabia do that? Well, Egypt has a big problem now. They just got caught bribing the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Ben Cardin, Democrat from Maryland.
So Robert Menendez,
in place of Bob Menendez. Ben Cardin has frozen aid to Egypt. God bless him. That's exactly the right decision. For reasons known only to them, on October the 4th, the Biden administration approved the release of $235 million of that aid. I don't know why they did that. I think this is just olive pays. We all remember, those of us who are old enough, just how much anger there was when Jonathan Pollard was caught back in the 1980s spying for Israel. Spying is not a violation of international law. Nations spy on each other. We spy on Israel. We spy on our allies. They spy on us. And yet there were all sorts of talks of cutting off aid. In this instance, bribing the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, that is not allowed under international law. So Egypt has an America problem. And if we agree to look the other way and maybe even throw in a little more aid, that would incentivize them. As far as Saudi Arabia goes, they desperately need to do this deal. They're not going to do it while they're shooting at each other. But once the shooting dies down, the things that push them to the peace table are going to keep pushing them. Maybe this could be the decisive bargaining chip that gets the deal done, where we say to Saudi Arabia, okay, we in America will give you that defense pact. We will let you enrich uranium with controls in place, but you got to help us out on Gaza. You got to make sure it stays quiet there from now on. You got to let the PA take over. I see that as a bit of a stretch, but I think it's achievable.
What about Iran? It's certainly flexing its muscles right now in terms of Hezbollah firing shots over the border, indeed, incursions. Israel's northern border. Obviously, much of American foreign policy and Israeli policy has revolved around the threat from Iran and what to do about it. Obviously, deep disagreements along those lines. Do you see them having the ability to sort of throw a monkey wrench into this? And because of course, they're neck deep in everything that Hamas does and pulling the strings with Hezbollah.
Correct. But I don't think they can stop anything, because what pushed Saudi Arabia to want to make peace with Israel, well, it's actually two things. One is just look at all those electric cars on the road. They got 10 more years to get this right, and then it's basically over, and they know that. So there's that. But there's also Iran. And, you like me are old enough to remember when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait way back in 1990. We would not have rescued Kuwait were it not for the fact that we needed Kuwaiti oil. And the Saudis know that. And they understand that when we no longer need their oil, and that's 10, 15 years out, that's it, that they're going to have a real serious security problem on their hands. So Iran is going to try to throw a monkey wrench in, sure, but that's what's in fact causing Saudi Arabia and a lot of the other Sunni Arab states into the American camp and into normalization with Israel in the first place.
Now, I guess the other obvious questions raised by your scenario, which is very hopeful, it certainly sounds like a better idea than what we have right now, is the future of the Islamist movement among the Palestinians. I think we both know that the reason why there hasn't been an election in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, since 2005, and Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, as you referred to him by his nom de guerre, he's serving the 19th year of the 4-year term to which he was elected.
You just stepped up my line. I was going to say that.
Everybody's been using that one for a long time. Sorry, but is that he fears Hamas. Hamas, as much as President Biden says the majority of the Palestinians have nothing to do with Hamas, Hamas is not unpopular. And, there are those who argue, I think, wrongly that, Richard Haas, one of the deans, of the foreign policy wise men and, one of the chief purveyors of conventional wisdom of the foreign policy establishment that has never stopped being wrong for decades, says that, Hamas is an idea. It's not, it's not just an organization. It can't be defeated. But as much as I think if it is militarily defeated and wiped out, it is defeated. But he's right to the extent that, it is still active on the West Bank and, it has a future. And, Fatah is very shaky, and as well as being anti-Semitic and, sort of supporting terror itself. How do you see that playing out?
It's very problematic. Look, even before the war, Hamas and even Islamic Jihad were taking over in Jenin and in northern Samaria, even without any of the things that are happening now. So somehow he's going to have to be propped up. He's an old sick man. He's he eats, he smokes, he sleeps, and he denies the Holocaust. That's pretty much all he's been doing the last couple of years. He's going to be replaced pretty soon. I hope there's no civil war among the different factions that are already forming in the field for the day after. It's a very difficult situation, but at least there are Israeli soldiers. And this is why, unfortunately, it's just not going to be possible to talk about some kind of a two-state solution in the near term until something changes within the culture of the Palestinian people. And who's going to implement that? I have absolutely no idea. But I will say this on a positive note. The Israelis have shown over time that they have learned to live with this. It is a manageable problem. It's a problem. And each time someone is killed, it is a whole world unto itself. It is absolutely heartbreaking. And I know people who've been killed and wounded by Palestinian terrorists, and I'll bet you do too. And it breaks your heart every time. Unfortunately, Judea, Samaria are going to go on being difficult. But I want to just stress, the unspoken assumption of much of the criticism, particularly from people like J Street, is, the problem is the settlements. The problem is the occupation. What this has proven is that that's just complete nonsense. The settlements were dismantled in Gaza. There was no occupation. They withdrew completely in 2005, and, here we are. And what's even worse is that even after Israel did that, it heard the same criticism. Amnesty International still called it an apartheid state. J Street still includes Gaza as part of the so-called demographic problem, which, by the way, there isn't one. The New York Times still says Gaza's under military occupation, beats the daylights out of me why they said this and kept saying this. So, Israel can't win one way or the other. It certainly does not argue for withdrawing, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think the assumption that this is going to lead to a two-state solution, I would argue that there has been two states since 2007. Hamas has been operating an independent Palestinian state in all but name in Gaza and used it in, it didn't turn out what Ariel Sharon and what now I think increasingly even people on the left understand was something of a blunder in 2005. It wasn't an incubator for peace. It was an incubator for terrorism and war. And, that's where Israel is left today.
Well, let me throw in a kind word for Ariel Sharon. He never said in 2005 that this is going to bring, peace to the land. That's what the Meretz Peace Party said, and that's why they're in the dustbin of history. And that's why the Labor Party is in the dustbin of history as well. They're down to 4 seats in the Knesset. That is the bare minimum. There's no such thing as having 3, 2, or 1. The Labor Party only got about 3.25% of the vote in the last election. And in all the polling, they're like at 1%. So they're done. So the Peace Party, they're done. Sharon never made that argument. What he said was, we can control it better from the outside than from the inside. We can control it better with deterrence. If they bomb us, we'll bomb them back. And we can control it better with a policy of incentives, which is what I described before of supplying Gaza, even though the two sides are at war. Again, Israel's the only country in the history of the world to supply its enemies in time of war. The New York Times calls it a blockade, beats the daylights out of me why that's a blockade. The most recent figures,
it's a blockade,
by the way,
that is run every day by the people supposedly, operating the blockade.
Well, there is no blockade. If you don't believe me, there's an Israeli human rights group called Gisha. It's spelled Gisha. Gisha means access in Hebrew. In the most recent year, 2022, over 67,000 trucks filled with supplies went into Gaza from Israel. So I don't know how that's a blockade. At least it is according to the New York Times, but I call that Groucho Marx journalism. You remember Groucho? Who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? So that's what that is.
Excellent point,
Yeah, and I have to say, for 18 years, the policy arguably did work. Israel's dead and wounded did drop dramatically from when it was an occupier. If you compare the two, they took 147 killed in the 5 years leading up to disengagement being in Gaza. They only took 122 killed in the 17 years after. That's progress. They also saved billions of dollars not having to support the Palestinians, because again, under Geneva Convention, you've got to assume responsibility, you got to pay salaries, you got to pick up the trash, etc. They gave up that responsibility, so the Europeans and the Qataris picked that up. So they saved a lot of money. They did save lives, but we saw what happened on October the 7th. Unfortunately, in the end, it just is not, it's not feasible for the long haul. Someone's got to go in there and run the show. They are going to have to be wards of the international community. The question is, who's going to run the show? I hope it's an Arab force, because the Arabs are the only ones who can make sure it stays peaceful there.
Yeah, well, like a lot of things, Sharon's strategy worked until it didn't, and obviously the what's going to be remembered is what happened last week, not the idea that it worked for a while. Unfortunately for his reputation. As for the Arabs running it, I hope you're right, but we'll see. Uri, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. 18 Days in October is both an interesting read and I think an important book, and I hope it gets the attention it deserves. And thanks so much for helping to highlight the parallels with today's crisis facing Israel. I also want to thank our audience.